We're going to continue our study tonight, and we're going to, yeah, George. Okay, George is in jail. And they're fully aware of his background, all the things that George. Yeah, yeah. We've prayed for George in the past. Struggles a lot, so continue to pray for him. Is his last name Hewitt? No. Weldon. Weldy. Richard, you got that? Thank you. We will pray for George. Are they in South Carolina? Yeah. Okay. Is he middle 20s by now? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, if you have your Bibles, we are going to continue our study, and I really enjoy the history and the details of the Old Testament. I must say I don't understand. A lot of times I was even preparing this, all the violence that's there. It just the happenings that are there. Well, last week we've been dealing with this. Get this like this, so I can get this up here. The last thing that we talked about last week was the idea of David again sparing Saul's life. And I think there was at least 3 times within the history of 1 Samuel that happened. So we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel 27. I'm going to read verse 21 and following in 26 because I want you to think about the person of David and the person of Saul. So here is Saul in 26, and David has spared his life again. And in verse 21 through the end of the chapter, he says, "Then Saul confessed, 'I have sinned. Come back home, my son, and I will no longer try to harm you, for you valued my life today. I have been a fool, very, very wrong.'" David's response, "Well, here's your spear, O king," David replied. "Let one of your younger men come over and get it. The Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal. I refuse to kill you, even when the Lord placed you in my power, for you are the Lord's anointed. Now may the Lord value my life, even as I have valued yours today. May he rescue me from all my troubles." And Saul said to David, "Blessings on you, my son David. You will do many heroic deeds, and you will surely succeed." Then David went away, and Saul returned home. We've seen this in the book of 1 Samuel over and over and over. Saul was Israel's first king. He was God's chosen king. But do you remember what happened to Saul? Why he fell out of favor with God? Exactly. If you go back real quick, we're not going to spend a lot of time there, but back in 1 Samuel 15, and here again, I do not understand. There's no commentator that can tell you either. I do not understand all the violence and all the killings and things that were there. But this I do understand. There's something very unique about the nation of Israel and Israel's people. And when God led them out of Egypt into what he was calling or giving them the promised land, he was very specific in the things that he told them to do. He was very disappointed in them, as we see that theme over and over and over in the Old Testament. But Samuel told Saul, "It was the Lord who told me to anoint you as king of his people. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. Do you remember what happened? He went into battle. He did everything he was supposed to do, except he kept the spoils, and he spared the life of the king. And because of that, you'll see that the response to that was that the blessings of God left him, and you see that over and over and over in the life of Saul. Did David have an easy life? No, I don't think so at all. Do you? He did not have an easy life, even though he was God's anointed. So tonight, as we move into chapter 27, and it should be up there for you on the screen, because this is a New Living. Yeah, there we go. And Patrick will flip through it. I'm going to read through it in my Bible. Don't know that we'll read all of it, but we'll see what happens. So here we are in 26. Here's the last encounter where David he literally went into and had the spear and could have taken Saul's life. So this is what David says. Now, but David in chapter 27, verse 1, but David kept thinking to himself, someday Saul's going to get me. So is that pretty logical, you think? All of his encounters with Saul have been in that way, haven't they? It's like run and hide, and opportunities to eliminate the pressure of Saul from his life. And we know from last week that he would not do it because he kept using that phraseology, God's anointed. So let's look and see what David says here. The best things I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting me in the Israelite territory, and I will finally be safe. Why do you think he went to the Philistines? They were the dreaded enemy of Israel, weren't they? And as you read the Old Testament, you see over and over and over the Philistines were fighting, and they were vicious people. And so David's in his own way. David's sort of is he a schemer? Can we say that? Do you think that's true, or is he just a good thinker? I'm not landing either way. I'm just saying you need to think about that, what it is. So David took his 600 men, and he went over to join the Achish, the son of Moach, the king of Gath. David and his men and their families settled there. They were in Gath. David brought his 2 wives along with him, Ahiman from Jezreel, and Abigail, Nabal's widow, from Carmel. Word soon reached Saul that David had fled to God, so he stopped hunting for him. So David was taking the pressure off for a while, wasn't he? And he was going into a different territory. He was really going into the enemy's camp. And it's very intriguing to me as we read on and see what happened in that scenario. So look at what he said. One day David said to Achish, if it's all right with you, we would rather live in one of the country towns instead of here in the royal city. What do you think David's thinking was toward that? Why do you think he wanted to do that? Gary? That's true. Joe? He wanted to get out of the limelight of the king, didn't he? He really did. And look at what he did. Now look, I want you to see the rest of this, what happened. So this in verse 6, he accomplished it and gave him the town of Ziklag, still belongs to Judah to the day, and they lived there among the Philistines for 1 year and 4 months. Now look at verse 8. David and his men spent their times raiding the Geshurites, the Gerizzites, and the Amalekites, people who lived near Shur toward the land of Egypt. Since ancient times, David did not leave one person alive in the villages he attacked. He took the sheep and the goat and the cattle and the donkeys and the clothing before returning home to the king. The king knew that he was doing his raids. We see that in the next verse that's there. David's not killing. He is not killing the Amalekites or the Israelites as they think he is. Where did you make your raid today? The king asked. And David would reply, against the south of Judea, the Jerahmeelites and the Canaanites. No one was left alive to come to Gath and tell where he had been. So David was literally wiping out everyone and everything, and the word was not there The word was not back to the king of what was actually happening. Verse 12. Achish believed David, and this is important too, and he thought to himself, by now the people of Israel must hate him bitterly. Look at the latter part of this verse 12. But now he will stay here and serve me forever. He's interested in David because he says, this guy is powerful and he's going to serve me. Well, let's read on in verse 28. So here's Saul. We know he's backed away from pursuing David because he knows he's living in Philistia and he's with the Philistines. So let's look at verse 28. About that time, the Philistines mustered their armies for another war with Israel. And King Achish told David, you and your men will be expected to join me in battle. Getting a little hairy here, isn't it? Look at David's response. Very well, David agreed. Now you will see for yourself what we can do. Does the Bible indicate that David prayed about that or asked God's guidance whether he should do that or not? He did. It doesn't, and he didn't. And we're going to see later on that most of the times when David encountered something like that, he did pray. He did ask God for should he do it or shouldn't he do it. But it's just almost like it's his response in doing this. You and your men will be expected to join me in battle. Very well, David agreed. Now you will see for yourselves what we can do. And Achish told David, I will make you my personal bodyguard for life. Not only was he going to stay there and serve him forever in verse 12 of 27, now he was going to be this king's bodyguard. So it was working. Well, here's what Saul does. Meanwhile, Samuel had died, and all of Israel had mourned for him. He was buried in Ramah, his hometown, and Saul banned from the land of Israel all mediums and those who consult the spirits of the dead. So here's Saul making this declaration to all of Israel. So here's what happens later. Here's what continues to happen. The Philistines set up their camp at Shunem, and Saul gathered all the army of Israel and camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the vast Philistine army, he became frantic with fear. What was one of the characteristics of Saul? One of his negative characteristics that we've studied and looked at before. Fear really controlled him in many ways. When he was going to be anointed king, we talked last time we met together, what did he do? Did he come in and say, I'm here? He hid. They had to find him to do that. So here he is here. He's banned all these things happening because he doesn't want to see these mediums, and he doesn't want this to happen. And he bans all these. So then now see what he does. He's going to break his own rules because he's fearful. He's so fearful. He asks the Lord what he should do. Now that's a Saul. But the Lord refused to answer him, either by dreams or by sacred lots or by prophets. So being fearful, not understanding what he should do, seeing that vast army out there that's going to attack him, he broke his own rules, and fear again ruled over him. It did. So then he said to his advisors, find a woman who is a medium. You think, were there men mediums too? Does anybody know? I don't. Just all women, or doesn't really say, does it? But he says, find one. Find a woman who is a medium. So that's exactly what happened. Refused to answer him. Then find a woman who's medium, and I can go and ask her to do it. His advisors replied, there is a medium at Endor. So Saul put on all of his royalty and his prestige and power and went to see her. Is that what it says? He disguised himself by wearing ordinary clothing instead of his royal robes. Then he went to the woman's house at night, accompanied by two of his men. I have to talk to a man who has died, he said. Will you call up his spirit for me? Look at her response. Are you trying to get me killed? The woman demanded. You know Saul has outlawed all mediums and all who consult the spirits of the dead. Why are you setting a trap for me? Now, look back real quick at verse 6 before we read on. He asked the Lord what he should do. The Lord refused to answer him, either by dream or sacred lights or prophets. And now look down here. You're setting a trap for me. You're going to get me killed. You know that Saul has outlined the mediums and all who commit the spirits of the dead. Why are you setting a trap for me? So look what Saul did. He took an oath in the name of the Lord and promised. So the Lord's not speaking to him or communicating to him anyway, but he's still taking an oath in the name of the Lord here. As surely as the Lord lives, nothing bad will happen to you doing this. Finally, the woman said, well, whose spirit do you want me to call up? Call up Samuel, Saul replied. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, you've deceived me. You are Saul. Don't be afraid, the king told her. What do you see? I see a God coming up out of the earth. His little g, she said. What does he look like? Saul asked. He's an old man wrapped in a robe. She replied. Saul realized it was Samuel, and he fell to the ground before him. Why have you disturbed me by calling me back? Samuel asked Saul. Look at the first part of this next verse. Because I am in deep trouble. It was all coming forward for Saul. I am in deep trouble. And Samuel was the one who had told Saul that his blessings were going to be lifted, and he wasn't, his anointing as being the king had been removed. Saul replied, the Philistines are at war with me, and God has left me and won't reply by prophet or dream, so I have called for you to tell me what to do. Look at Samuel's reply. Why ask me, since the Lord has left you and has become your enemy? The Lord has done just as he said he would, for he has torn the kingdom from you and given it to your rival David. The Lord has done this to you today because you refused to carry out his fierce anger against the Amalekites, which we saw in 1 Samuel 15. What's more, the Lord will hand you and the army of Israel over to the Philistines tomorrow. And you and your sons will be here with me. The Lord will bring down the entire army of Israel in defeat. Now again, it's pretty tough to be coming, and we could understand how someone would respond differently, do that. But again, look at Saul's immediate response. And I'm not belittling this at all, but look at his immediate response. Saul fell full length on the ground, paralyzed with fright because of Samuel's words. He was also faint with hunger, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. Do you see a difference in the response between these two men, between how Saul responded to adversity and trouble and how David responded to adversity and trouble? They both have adversity and trouble in their lives. Saul responded usually in a frightening way, and he pulled away, it seems to me, like from the Lord. And then in the last second, he'd say, well, maybe I can get God to speak to me. And David always was consulting God and was making sure that he did things the way he should do things until we get later on into his kingdom, and then we know the great fall that he had. So here's Saul again. He's in full length. He was a big man too, as we know. Paralyzed with fright because of Samuel's words. He was also faint with hunger and eat nothing all day and all night. Now you can imagine what this lady, how she was responding to it. And I think it's interesting here how she responds. She didn't respond. She responded in a human way, in seeing Saul distraught and almost paralyzed in fear. Verse 21. When the woman saw how distraught he was, she said, Sir, I obeyed your command at the risk of my life. Look how bold she was there. Now do what I say. Let me give you little something to eat so you can regain your strength for the trip back. Saul refused to eat anything. He was still paralyzed by the fear. Then his advisors joined the woman in urging him to eat. So he finally yielded and got up from the ground and he sat on the couch. The woman had been fattening a calf, and she hurried and killed it. She took flour, she made bread, and then she brought meal to Saul and his advisors. They ate. Then they went out into the night. So Saul has found out that his kingdom is in battle, that he's in trouble, very much in trouble. Verse 29, or chapter 29. Here's David again, and he's already told Achish that he will fight with the Philistines against Israel. The entire Philistine army now mobilized at Aphek, and the Israelites camped in the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers were leading out their troops in groups of hundreds and thousands, remember David had 600 men. David and his men marched at the rear with King Achish. But the Philistine commanders, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish told him, hey, this is David, the servant of King Saul. He's been with me for years, and I've never had a single fault in him from the day he arrived until today. The Philistine commanders, all the rest of the army, they were very angry, and they send him back to the town you've given him. He can't go into battle with us. What if he turns against us in battle and he becomes our adversary? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master by his handing our heads over to him? Again, these folks knew about the relationship of David and Saul. And even in their understanding, the word probably was out that David had more than one time to eliminate Saul, and he hadn't. And so they're saying, I don't know about bringing him with us in battle at all. Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by handing our heads over to him? Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000. So you see what's all beginning here. So Achish finally summoned David, and he said to him, I swear by the Lord that you have been a trustworthy ally. David's pulled the wool over his eyes the whole time. I think you should go with me into battle, for I've never had a single flaw in you from the day you arrived until today. But the other Philistine rulers won't hear of it. Please don't be upset, but go back quickly. What have I done? And here comes David's defense. What have I done to deserve this treatment David demanded? What have you ever found in your servant that I can't go and fight the enemies of my Lord the king? But Achish insisted, as far as I'm concerned, you are as perfect as an angel of God. What a statement. Wow. But the Philistine commanders are afraid to have you with them in battle. Now get up early in the morning and leave your men with your men as soon as it gets light. So David and his men headed back into the land of the Philistines, while the Philistine army went to Jezreel. Was God orchestrating all this, do you think? Had to be, didn't he? Because David would have been compromised in many ways. Now, what we get into in chapter 30 is when David goes back to the city where they were living, to Ziklag. It's a pretty tough scene for them. So let's read on in chapter 30 here. 3 days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They carried off the women and the children and everything else, but without killing anyone. Why didn't they kill anyone? I'm sorry? Could be. Any other thoughts? What had David been doing to all these people that he had raided? It was very common in that day. They wiped out everything and everybody. So I guess I'm saying, is there not an underlay, Ernie? Right. That's exactly right. Right. And he didn't want any witnesses at all. And I still think he remembered, don't you think he was still remembering how Saul had failed the Lord by not doing what he said he would do, and now David did not want to do that. So they didn't kill anyone, but they burned down the city and they carried off all their wives and their children and everything else they had. So in verse 3, when David and his men saw the ruins, they realized what had happened to their families, and they wept until they could weep no more. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel, were among those captured. Now look at this, is very interesting what the response that we begin to see here in verse 6. David was now in great danger, not from Saul, but from his own men. His own men. Look at the wisdom that David had. Were bitter about losing their sons and their daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. Did David hide? Did he go back in the cave? Did he run away? What's it say? David found strength in the Lord his God. Lord, I'm in a tough spot right here. And I know that they're wanting to stone me, my own people. Lord, I need your help. I need your help here. So how many times in our own lives, sometimes we want to take things into our own hands and we want to solve them ourselves. How much better off would we be if that was our response? David found strength in the Lord his God. Then he said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. What was the ephod? Anybody remember? The priestly garment, wasn't it? That they wore. So he said, bring that to me. And I don't really understand why it was needed, but it was something that they used when they approached the Lord, and when the priest did that. So Abiathar brought it. David asked the Lord, should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them? And the Lord told him, you go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you. Now just remember, they had lost everything. Their wives, their children, they'd burned their city, their livestock, it was all gone. And then the men were getting very bitter because of this is David. If we'd been here, this would never have happened. But look at what happens. So David finally, and his 600 men went out. And they came to the brook of Besor. 200 of the men were exhausted to cross the brook. So David continued the pursuit with 400 men. Keep that in mind. Keep that in your mind's eye. 200 men stayed. They were exhausted. They couldn't go farther. And yet David and 400 of his men pushed on. Along the way, they found an Egyptian man in the field. They brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and some water to drink. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, for he hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 3 days and 3 nights before his strength returned. And look at what he says, and look at the latter part of verse 13. David asks him, whom do you belong? Where do you come from? I am an Egyptian. I am a slave of an Amalekite, he replied. Now here's an Amalekite. I'm surprised that this man wasn't killed. He wasn't eradicated. But he wasn't. What did they do to him? They helped him. They fed him. They strengthened. They strengthened him. They helped him. He says, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite, he replied. My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I was sick. And look at what he'd done. We were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, in the territory of Judah in the land of Caleb. They were raiding and killing the Israelites. And we just burned Ziklag. Now, if this man has just spilled all the beans and not knowing who David was, not knowing that that's where David had been, I'm surprised that but here again, here's the wisdom and the insight of David, even in tough, traumatic times. And he doesn't seem like he chastises the man. He says in verse 15, will you lead me to this band of David? David asked, this band of raiders. The young man replied, if you take an oath in God's name. So here's Saul making an oath. And now here's this young man. If you will take an oath in God's name, that you will not kill me or give me back to my master, then I will guide you to them. So he led David to them, and they found the Amalekites spread out across the field, eating and drinking and dancing. with joy because of the vast amounts of plunder they had taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah. What do you see there when you read those verses? Woodstock, a big party, a big field opened up. They were just overjoyed with all the things that they had. They had no idea that anyone was looking for them or coming after them. Just drinking and dancing with joy. The vast amount of plunders that they had taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah. And here's David. Look at this response. Now remember, there's not 600 men, there's 400. David and his men rushed in among them, and they slaughtered them throughout the night. And the entire next day until evening, none of the Amalekites escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. They slaughtered them. They wiped out everything. That is so hard for us in our culture and our time to understand. I mean, does it make you feel a little... It's just a hard thing to understand, but yet it's what happened. Well, David got back everything the Amalekites had taken, and he rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, great or small, son or daughter, nor anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. He also recovered all the flocks and the herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock. This plunder belongs to David, they said. Now David's going to return to where the 200 men are that were too exhausted to move forward and do what they had to do. Then David returned to the brook of Besor and met up with 200 men who had been left behind because they were too exhausted to go with him. They went out to meet David and his men, and David greeted them joyfully. Really important. David greeted them joyfully. Now look at what David had to deal with next. They didn't go with us. They didn't go with us because of this. Some evil troublemakers among David's men, they didn't go with us. So they can't have any of the plunder we recovered. Give them their wives and their children and tell them to be gone. Pretty normal response, right? Look, hey, you didn't have any flesh in this game. You just sat here by the brook, went fishing or rested, or we literally put ourselves on the line and God delivered us and we got all this stuff. Look at what David said. No, my brothers, don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. He has kept us safe and helped us defeat the band of raiders that attacked us. What a statement. Do we respond that way today always? I don't know that we do. So there's a real life lesson there for all of us. What the Lord has given us. He has kept us safe and helped us defeat the band of raiders that attacked us. Who will listen when you talk like this? We share and share alike. Those who go to battle and those who guard the equipment. From then on, David made this a decree and a regulation for Israel, for it's still followed today. David, in his wisdom and his discernment through all the trials and struggles that he had, he knew at the right time, it seems like in the middle of conflict or heated, he just knew what to say and what to do. He was a leader. He was a leader of people. Well, so in verse 26, he arrived back at Ziklag, and David spent part of the plunder. He sent part of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends. Here's a present for you, taken from the Lord's enemies, he said. The gifts were sent to the people of the following towns David visited: Bethel and Ramoth, Negeb, Jatir, Arior, Sifmoth, Estioma, Rakal, the towns of the Jeshmalites and the towns of the Canaanites, Hormah, Bor Ashan, Atach, Hebron, and other places David and his men had visited. What do you see there in David? What kind of a characteristic? When the pressure came on Saul, we established that Saul did what? He was fearful. And here's David through all this situation, and he's been this abundance that he's been given, and what does he do? He shares it. He spreads it. He gives it. He shares it. And just you see the difference in the two men as we go through this. Well, in verse 31, we'll finish this chapter, and we'll look a little bit in first chapter of Samuel if we have time. But this is the death of Saul. And we know that when Saul did this silly thing to call up the medium and find out, he brought Samuel back from the dead, and Samuel said that Saul and his sons would die on the battlefield. And this indeed is the narrative that talks about that. Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. The many were slaughtered on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Who was David's favorite son of all of them? Jonathan. They were like brothers, deep, deep brothers. So all were killed. Fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistines' archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. So here's Saul in the battlefield, and he's wounded severely. Saul groaned to his armor bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come to run me through and taunt me and torture me." But his armor bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and he fell on it. When his armor bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. Why? It's going to tell us a little bit later on, but why do you think Saul didn't want the Philistines to kill him? They might keep him alive and mock him and torture him, and what they ended up doing to him is pretty awful anyway. More honorable to die in battle, exactly. That's right, Judy. So when the Israelites on the other side of the Jezreel Valley and beyond the Jordan saw the Israelite army had fled, and Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and they fled. So the Philistines moved in and occupied their towns. Sad scenario for Israel. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. Cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death in their pagan temple and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroths, and they fastened his body to the wall in the city of Beth Shan. What happened when David killed Goliath? Cut his head off. So this must have been one of the routine things you did when you at the end of this, and it was shameful. When the people of Gash Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors traveled through the night to Bashan and took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall. They brought them to Jabesh, where they burned the bodies, and they took their bones and buried them beneath the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. In all, through this narrative of 1 Samuel, David kept his conviction that he was not to remove God's anointed. Saul died in battle. So let's look at the first chapter of 2 Samuel with what time we have left. So David is learning now about Saul's death. After the death of Saul, David returned from his victory over the Amalekites, and he spent 2 days in Ziklag. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's army. Interesting. He had torn his clothes and put dirt on his head to show that he was mourning, and he fell to the ground before David in deep respect. "Where have you come from?" David asked. "I escaped from the Israelite camp," the man replied. "Well, what happened?" David demanded. "Tell me how the battle went." The man replied, "Our entire army fled from the battle. Many of the men are dead. Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." David questions him. "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan are dead?" David demanded of the young man. This is where it gets a little dicey for this young man, as he embellishes the story that's not true at all. The man answered, I happened to be on the Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the enemy chariots and charioteers closing in on him. When he turned and saw me, he cried out for me to come to him. How can I help him? He asked. He responded, Who are you? I am an Amalekite, who Saul was supposed to eradicate in the first place. And he's telling this story now to David, and it's false. It's not true at all. I told him. Then he begged me, Come over here and put me out of my misery, for I'm in terrible pain. I want to die. So I killed him. The Amalekite told David. Well, you can just imagine all that David had been through, what just went through him with that. This Amalekite killed the Lord's anointed? What? We know it's not true, but that's what David was told. So I killed him, the Amalekite told David, for I knew he couldn't live. Then I took his crown and his armband, and I brought them here to you, my Lord. David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard this. They mourned and they wept and they fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and for the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. Then David said to the young man who brought the news, Where are you from? And he replied, This was his downfall, to say the least. I am a foreigner, an Amalekite, who lives in your land. Why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed one? David asked. Here is David through all of this, he's been through with Saul. He just found out Saul's dead, and he still is looking that Saul was David's anointed one. Why? Why did you not? Why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed one? David asked. And David said to his men, Kill him. So the man thrust his sword into the Amalekite, and he killed him. You have condemned yourself, David said, for you yourself confess that you killed the Lord's anointed one. Did he? He did not, did he? Saul ended up taking his own life, didn't he? But it's really ironic that this guy comes who's an Amalekite and is bragging to David that he had killed the Lord's anointed. And David's response is, Why have you killed the Lord's anointed? And Saul actually died the way that David hoped that he would die. The Lord himself would take him out, whether it was in battle or natural causes or whatever, and we know it was in battle. So then David wrote a song. David's song for Saul and Jonathan. We'll go through this, not real super close. David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it's recorded in the book of Jashar. Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughter of the Philistines will rejoice, and the pagans will laugh in triumph. O mountain of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no fruitful fields producing offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty hero was defiled. The shield of Saul will no longer be anointed with oil. The blow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work. Now, I want you to just these next verses and think about all that David has been through, all that Saul has tried to do him. And yet in this eulogy of Saul, he is still, he's lifting Saul up. He's still admitting things, not bitter towards Saul, even though he knew that Saul would do anything to kill him. Look at these responses. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul, it did its mighty work. They shed the blood of their enemies, and they pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious were Saul and Jonathan. They were together in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep for Saul, for he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing, and garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. And then he really begins to lament for Jonathan. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. Oh, how I weep for you, my brother Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you. All your love and your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Stripped of their weapons, they lie dead. In these tragic events of what we've looked at tonight with Saul's death and seeing another picture again of Saul and his anxieties and fears and David through all the trials and tribulations he'd been through, yet he was still so obedient in this part of his life to exactly what God would have him to do. He consulted with God and he wept desperately. Even in his own way, he loved Saul, and there's no question that he loved Jonathan deeply. Next week, when Josh is back, whoever teaches, we'll get into the idea of David being anointed king of Judah. Let's see what we've got for the last four there, Patrick, if you'll put them up. What? See what you think. So what? How David protected the Lord's anointed. Over and over, theme through 1 Samuel. Just remember that even through the adversity and all the nasty things that Saul wanted to do to him, David protected him. Number two, deception in David's case is a question. Was it part of God's plan when he went with the Philistines? It had to be, didn't it? It had. It doesn't specifically tell us that. Or are you shaking your head? Yeah, I agree. The God of the Old Testament, the way things operate in the Old Testament, and the God of it's just, I agree, and it's caused a lot of people to what, Judy? Right, I agree with that, and that's really what he was doing with wiping out all the thinking he was killing. Yeah, for sure. Right. So, right. Yep, that's exactly true. It's just I'm with Ernie. I wrestled with all the killing. Number three, it's premier all throughout the Old Testament. Yes, there's no question about it. In 1 Samuel 15, that's what got Saul in the pickle in the first place, wasn't it? It's still hard to understand all of the killing, but that's right. And God obviously protected David when he was making all these raids, that nothing got back to him, for sure. Oh yeah, the Amalekites came from a grandson of Esau, and they are still just how it is. Exactly, that's right. David, number three, David's obedience, Saul's disobedience. See that, don't we? All through what we've looked at all through this chapter. Number four, David's answer was always in his struggle and all that he went through. Even when we get farther into 2 Samuel and we see the issue of what David, this isn't the David we've studied so far. When we see with Bathsheba and all that he did, even in the struggle, he still knew that his answer always came from God, and he took it on, and he repented. It's David, such an interesting character, a man after God's own heart. Any other thoughts, comments? Yeah, I agree. He was a leader. People responded to him. There's no question about that. But we see the strengths of David, and as we go on through Second Samuel, we're going to see some of the flaws of David. And yet we're going to see that he took responsibility, and he always wanted to honor God. Anyone else?
Do you think God loves each one of us as believers as much as he loved David?
I don't know, Gary. I would hope so. I would hope so. I find myself at times being frustrated with myself that I'm not wanting to be closer to God in that fellowship, in that in an intimate way with Him. David was that way. It seems like David was drawn to that, but it was always through that struggle, through that they're killing me, or the battle, or whatever it would be. Yeah, he did a lot. He definitely did, and he repented. Yeah, that's the only thing that always scared me about being a parent. One of the things that drove me, at least to try to be a little better than I could be. When you see in the Bible, you look at Solomon, and then you look at Absalom, and you see what happened, and it destroyed his family. And I did not want to be the kind of man that lived in a way that my family was destroyed. That's hard. That's really hard stuff. But that's a real true principle that's really there. Anyone else? Ernie?
Like he was not the best father. I think you would have more than one wife.
You talking about Solomon? Oh, David with his two. Okay.
You only have so much time to spend with your family.
Right.
Plus, there's going to be conflict between those boys.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. I never understood more than I'm really thankful for the wife I've got, but to have two at the same time, I don't. Yeah. What do you think, Joe? Wouldn't do like that in Jersey, would it? Yeah. David's very interesting. It's going to be even more interesting as we plow into 2 Samuel more. So, yeah. And David's going to get another wife back too, isn't he? Michal comes back, his wife from Saul's daughter that was taken. So, yeah. Any thoughts? Well, let's close. Father, thank you for your word, for the truth of your word. And as we've looked at it today, tonight, together, thank you that you've spoken to us through the precious Holy Spirit. May we learn from the examples that we see and help us to be the men and women, the husbands, the mothers, the fathers that we need to be. We love you and we thank you for Jesus. Thank you we can gather tonight. In your name we pray. Amen.